Hi, I'm Vic Kelly. I'm deaf and I'm talking about the fundamentals of sign languages. So, in the first three videos in this series, I talked about hand shape, orientation, location, movement, and non-manual markers like facial expression. This time I'm talking about something you can't see or touch, and that is the cultural context in which a sign language developed. If we take Irish Sign Language, the sign language that I use, it developed within Ireland. The cultural context of the Irish deaf community informed how Irish Sign Language developed. For example, in Ireland, because education was segregated on the basis of the gender assigned at birth, so boys went to boys' school, girls went to girls' school, and there were differences within those communities of deaf children who were learning in a segregated space. There are signs that are considered to be more of a woman's sign and signs that are considered to be more of a man's sign. Now, this becomes blurred with younger deaf people in Ireland, where there's more crossover, and so there's less kind of a strict segregation. But when you're communicating with an older deaf person in Ireland, you will notice it's very specific to Ireland. And because Ireland largely still does have segregated education, but just across the Irish Sea in Great Britain, British Sign Language didn't have this segregation within the community of deaf children learning to sign. And so they don't have those gender differences. And that's an example of how the cultural context of the deaf community can influence things. As I mentioned, there are over 200 sign languages in the world that are recognized. And that is over 200 distinct languages. So if someone were to, count up the spoken languages in the world and say, that's the number of languages there are, they would be wrong because that's only the number of spoken languages. There are also the sign languages, so you have to add at least 200 to that number. Every single sign language of those 200 has its idiosyncrasies and relationships, just like with spoken languages. So in spoken languages, we talk about the Germanic languages, German, Dutch, Danish, Swedish, Norwegian, or they'll talk about the Romance languages and the dead language of Latin, and then Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, French. And yeah, there are language groups and there's a relationship, but if you speak fluent French, that doesn't mean you speak fluent Spanish. By that same token, a lot of sign languages that are related to French Sign Language, or linguistically, French Sign Language is older than them. There's an influence of some kind. For example, people from Ireland went to France, studied French Sign Language, came back and started teaching that in Ireland, but over time it changed. So the relationship is there, but that doesn't make them mutually intelligible. The French Sign Language influenced Irish Sign Language and it influenced American Sign Language. But what it did not influence was British Sign Language. And that comes to one of the things that's a big kind of shock to people is that British Sign Language and Irish Sign Language have almost no overlap. There are some signs that we have borrowed from British Sign Language, usually in STEM, but in terms of the day-to-day sign, there's no mutual intelligibility. Even the alphabet is different because Irish Sign Language, like French and American Sign Language, uses one hand to sign the alphabet. British Sign Language uses two. So even if a British deaf person were signing to me and finger spelling English words, if I didn't know the British sign alphabet perfectly, I wouldn't be able to understand, and they wouldn't follow what I was finger spelling to them. So all these countries that speak English as their main language have different sign languages because the cultural context and the history of the sign language and the deaf community were different. British Sign Language had already quite a strong presence, and they didn't look to other countries to sort of borrow the model of things. But in Ireland, there was a lot of home sign, which is a sign language that develops within a family or within a small community to communicate with a deaf person. But that wasn't sort of nationwide. And when they started trying to formalize sign language education for deaf people, they borrowed from outside. So the names of sign languages, I think, are sometimes what causes a confusion when we start talking about the cultural context. If you look at French sign language, people take French to mean la language French. So it's the sign language representing French. It's not. The French is the adjective for the nation. So it's the sign language of France. German Sign Language is the sign language of Germany, not German, but in sign. Danish Sign Language, Irish Sign Language, British Sign Language, American Sign Language. The adjective at the beginning represents the nation or culture in which it developed rather than the spoken language of that nation or culture. Deaf communities are vibrant, complex, living communities. And the language, the sign language of that deaf community is a living, vibrant, complex language. And that means it changes over time. Signs change across generations, between genders, or on a basis of race. There can be multiple sign languages within a country. So how does a sign language differ from a spoken language? European spoken and written languages have declination and conjugation. They have definite and indefinite articles. And what all of that means is if you take a verb, you change the form of the verb to indicate the person it relates to and or the time that the event happened, so past, present, future. If you take a noun, you have a singular form, a plural form. You might also have forms that indicate whether it is the subject or the object of the sentence. With articles, in English you have a and the. In German you have der, die, das, and then you have the changes that those go through. So you have all of these things that change the word itself, like its form, its spelling, or something like that. You change the word to indicate additional information. But the sign languages that I know from Europe, they don't have definite and indefinite articles. There's no way of saying a or the. They don't have declination and conjugation. So the word meet or the word good or the word or aunt, they don't change anything about themselves. We don't have those changes to consider. That doesn't map onto English, doesn't map onto Irish either. So that mapping, that one-to-one mapping doesn't work. The sign languages are old. 5th century BC, there was writing about sign language. So sign languages can have an extremely long history and a complex one. There wasn't necessarily a lot written about them. If you read up on Irish Sign Language, sometimes it sounds like it started with people going to France, picking up French Sign Language, bringing it to Ireland, and adapting it to the local context. But that's not the case. There were definitely sign languages, possibly more than one within Ireland, that sort of merged with that. And hearing people don't determine what a sign language is. Hearing teachers within older school systems may have tried to influence or enforce a type or style of communication that they thought was most appropriate or correct. That didn't mean it ended up being the sign language of that deaf community. That community would have taken what they were already using, taken new ideas of their own, taken things they were being taught or things that were being forced on them. And from that, something develops. Some sign languages have a body that says what is an official sign and what isn't. Some don't. Irish Sign Language is notoriously unregulated, so it's quite common for there to be even some arguments about whether something is the official sign for a particular thing. Even something as simple as the days of the week can have different signs and arguments over which is official. When you're learning a sign language, the best thing you can do is to find a deaf teacher who will not only instruct you on hand shape orientation, location movement, but also on the culture that informs that sign language and educate you on the subtle variations that can go on within that sign language and the ways that people communicate in real terms. When I did my first two Irish Sign Language courses, when I realized I was going deaf and it was not something that I was going to correct with medical devices permanently. My first teacher was deaf, was teaching within a particular system that had an exam at the end of the course because you got a certificate. And because of that, the signs were you learn these ones and these are the correct ones. But after that, when I started learning with deaf tutors that didn't kind of focus on what was going to be graded correctly in a supervised exam, then they were much more inclined to be, well, you can sign it this way or you can sign it this way. I prefer this, and so on. So if you're learning sign language from a deaf person, you can really benefit from these cultural insights. And if you're learning sign language from multiple deaf people or interacting with different deaf people of different backgrounds, you will learn faster, you'll learn more. I'm not saying that a hearing person cannot teach sign language. Of course, they can if they have the proper qualifications. Just as, when I was teaching English out in Poland, there were excellent English teachers who had been born in Poland, grown up in Poland, and gone to university, studied English, studied pedagogy, so had a good background in didactics and so on. And they were excellent English teachers. Understanding something about the culture of the deaf community in which the sign language you're learning developed is so important. Understanding the background of the people, the things they went through, the things they may have struggled against, like oralism in schools, or language deprivation, or segregation, genocides, so cultural genocide. That will really inform a lot about how you understand why this sign, why this non-manual marker, why this movement, why is this different? Why does Irish Sign Language use the British sign for referral, like a referral from a doctor to a specialist? Why do some people in Ireland use company and some people company? Those are cultural things, and it really does help to understand. So, cultural context. Sign language don't develop in a vacuum. They develop within the culture of the deaf community, and that deaf community influences the development of the sign language, its dialects, its forms, and its vibrant future. One of the most important things to take away from this is deaf people in a country form a community and a culture, and the language that they use is a vibrant and living language that deserves respect and deserves to be recognized as an official language of the country. Deaf people shouldn't be cut out of conversations about sign language and what's official and what's not official. Deaf people shouldn't be cut out of conversations about education of deaf children. And I'm late deafened. I'm entering a community in Ireland that already exists and already is vibrant. I will follow their lead when it comes to talking about sign languages. And I will always run things by a tutor and someone who is from the culture before saying them on in these videos, because as much as Irish Sign Language is a language that I now use and I use every day, it is a language that I have the privilege of learning from members of the Irish deaf community. And from that point of view, I'm always going to follow their lead. Okay. So if you want to know more about me, I have a blog. Um, links right there. I also have a Patreon if you feel like supporting what I'm doing. It's right there. Links are also below. Thank you for listening and see you again soon.